Hi, everyone. This is Tim Riesterer, and welcome back to the Social Selling Summit. Really great to have you here today, and it's my honor and privilege to present maybe a unique angle for the Social Selling Summit. I always appreciate the invite and being able to talk about content, the actual messages, as messages get communicated through social and demand is generated, and salespeople have to respond to that demand and have great customer conversations. This becomes an important part of the social selling system at your company. So we're going to talk about content over the next 30 minutes here together. One of the things that I want to identify is that there's a Twitter handle here, because that's only important. I mean, it is vitally important here in a social selling summit. So you can get to my Twitter handle right here, and I'm excited to share with you some of the things that we've been learning over the last few months. Where I'm going to go today is to think about sort of the buyer's journey, not unusual for an event like this, and think about the questions that customers, prospects have to answer themselves for themselves as they decide between staying the same and doing what they've been doing or considering a change and doing something different. And I do this by bringing up the statistic of the decade, the idea that people believe they're 57 or so % of the way done with the buyer's journey before they invite salespeople in. I think it's now legally required that you use this statistic to open any event. But I'm opening my event with it not in order to corroborate it, but I'm actually opening it to my event to challenge it. What we're seeing as we analyze with some of our research partners the disposition of selling pipelines at the end of life, qualified sales pipelines. When people think they're 60% of the way done, we're seeing that what they're actually doing is making 60% no decision. In other words, they think they're far along on the buyer's journey. They get to the end of the buyer's journey and actually decide to do nothing, make no decision, just stick with their status quo. So I ultimately want to challenge right now this idea of the buyer's journey being 60% of the way done when a salesperson shows up. And it affects social selling, because the salesperson needs to know that the job isn't done and you aren't there to just take over the last part of the sales cycle. The majority of the people you're interacting with haven't even decided to change yet. They actually aren't ready to have a discussion about why you versus your competitors. The majority of the people you are interacting with. And as a result, the messaging and content you need has to answer the first question, why change? Help people decide to leave their status quo and make a decision before ever talking about you versus your competitors. So I believe actually that statistic that people are 60% of the way done is absolute bunk, and that in reality people don't know how far they are because the majority of the time they do nothing. So with that in mind, we need to think about this a little bit differently, and I want to credit Forrester, who was just on previously to me, for these few stats that I'm about to share. They identified that buyers will give the business the majority of the time to the person who creates the buying vision. 74% of buyers identified that they give the business ultimately, even if it goes to an RFP or a bake-off, they give the business to the one who inspired the vision for change and the vision to do something different. In other words, they created the buying vision. Only 26% give the business in a fair and square competitive bake-off. So the opportunity in the social selling environment is that you need to create the buying vision, answer the why change question if you want to create an unfair competitive advantage, and that the primary purpose of content in the social selling environment is to generate that particular dialogue and get your unfair competitive advantage. We also see from Forrester that first calls that salespeople make after they make some initial contact are 90% of the time failures, according to these executive buyers. So there clearly is a gap. There clearly is a disconnect in the B2B buying environment where the messages that are being created, the content that's being created in order to build demand and enable salespeople is somehow missing the mark, because conversations salespeople are having are not paying off all the work that you're doing in the social selling environment. Here's some research that we did. We put about 500 salespeople through a survey, and we asked them to rank 5 different selling conversations. I'm going to quickly articulate those. The first was opportunity creation, building and generating leads, solution presentation, differentiating from the competition, executive proposals, building business cases to justify your offering, deal negotiations, efforts to protect pricing and margins, and fifth, contract renewals and loyalty. 5 distinct conversations salespeople need to be good at, and we ask them, which one do you feel your company prepares you the most for, and which one do you feel is most important? And here's what we discovered, that salespeople feel they are most prepared by their company to have the why you conversation, the competitive differentiation conversation, the so-called solution presentation. Here's what we do, how we do it better, and what value you're going to get. But of those 5 conversations I mentioned, they feel it's the second least important out of 5 for them to grow their business and do their job and make strides to improve on hitting quota. In fact, the one that they said they felt was most important to making their number, salespeople, was opportunity creation. In other words, I don't think ironically, the why change, create the buying vision conversation. And so as a result, unfortunately, they said this is the one they feel the least prepared by the organization to have. Now, why might that be the case? If you think of the buying cycle as I identified it earlier, you can think of the why change, why you conversation as sort of having 2 moments of truth. The online self-service environment, I like to call it, self-service, and then the kinds of dialogues or kinds of assets or kinds of rich content that you serve up over social media, your digital strategy, infographics, videos, ebooks, white papers, case studies, those kinds of things that you offer up in all these environments as links and registrations and landing pages to gain and get this information. The other way to think about this then is that there's another moment in this dialogue which is then sales directed. Salespeople are in charge of the conversation, not the online self-service environment. But here's what we see in hundreds of companies. The primary set of content and messaging assets created for the salesperson, no doubt, after the research we did, and then as we looked at companies and audited their content for sales, falls in that YU category: presentation content, collateral, leave behind, follow-up content, demonstration content, proposal content. The bulk of what gets created in the name of sales enablement is for that last mile of the journey. It literally emphasizes this idea that, hey, you're in charge of the why you, why us differentiation story. On the social side of things, the demand gen side of things, we'll take care of the why change and create the buying vision. What we see happening, here's where the disconnect happens, is we think there's a missing link. There's a missing link where the salesperson is getting a bad handoff or taking a bad handoff, and we call it the conversion gap. All the interest and excitement created through social activities, the story, the why change, build a buying vision, disrupt the status quo, then leads to an opportunity for a salesperson to have a conversation. And all of their training and all of their tools and materials are focused on the product and the competitive differentiation set and how to tell that story, almost like a demo story. So we think there's a big conversion gap here where leads moving into sales conversation are missing the mark because there is no messaging and no content that the salesperson carries over. In fact, we did an additional piece of research on this and identified by asking marketing and sales training sides of the house on what their alignment looks like. And only 10% of the companies that we surveyed, there were over 300 companies in the survey, believe that they're aligned between demand generation that sets up the conversation and then sales training, which trains salespeople to have that conversation. Only 10% felt that they had alignment there. So in other words, what was going on the demand generation side was siloed from what was happening on the sales enablement side. And then we wonder why these conversations are failing, why salespeople are feeling ill-equipped for the most important conversation, and why so many deals end up in no decision. So we asked then a follow-on question. Where specifically do you feel the gap is in terms of your alignment between demand generation, messaging, content, social, and sales selling content, messaging, training, and social? And they identified particularly in the area of asset and content. Just like we had identified, it turns out that the conversion gap is happening exactly where we expected. They're missing the content, assets, the messaging to enable salespeople at that moment of taking the demand-generated handoff, the why change handoff. It's too big of a leap between the why change hand raiser who said, I want to know more about this, and salespeople showing up with their inherently product-centric training and content. And it's like the customer almost feels like they've had two different dialogues with the company on two entirely different planes. And as a result, I think that's why you see in the conversion gap 89% first call failures and due to the 90% misalignment. So what I want to do is kind of give you an idea for how to bridge this. Set up the problem and now give you a fix. The problem being that there's no why change content for sales. And I think the problem started when people thought sales didn't have responsibility for that dialogue because of this misguided statistic. And when we look a little bit deeper, we see huge amounts of failure and roadblocks and, if you will, speed bumps on the way to converting that. And we believe it's because salespeople are missing the content, the messaging, and the skills to have this initial conversation spurred on by the social selling activity. So what I want to talk to you about today is an idea for a fix. And if you remember, we said that salespeople identified that they're least prepared for the conversation they feel is the most important for them to hit their growth targets. And they identified that as the opportunity creation conversation. And in second to last place, it was the traditional solution presentation. So let's talk about that opportunity creation conversation as a moment of truth that salespeople feel they want to be better at, and it's their most important moment, and how you, now seeing that there's a conversion gap problem, can fill it. And the idea here is literally a dedicated messaging experience for the salesperson that literally helps them through that first stage, that hard part, that transition from the lead to the actual selling conversation. And we've identified here an interactive playbook opportunity. And before you go, oh, playbooks, let's just take a look at what's really going on here in terms of why this is specifically designed and how it specifically works to guide someone through that all-important, hardest part that they want the most help in. So as we take a deeper dive, I want you to notice here across the top of the interactive playbook here, a very specific set of engaging activities for salespeople to think about. And so what's happening is we're building playbooks like this when there are major product launches and you're going out and doing tremendous demand gen and social and all kinds of air cover, and now the poor salesperson has to pick it up from there and turn it into a legitimate why change conversation that creates more qualified pipeline that will actually close versus going to no decision. There are things they need to know in order to pick this up and run with it. So these particular topics were pre-designed in order to specifically deal with the opportunity creation moment, that gap that they have. So let's take a deeper look at it real quick. I don't think this is rocket science, but what we're looking at here is this idea that you must be able to help the salesperson understand who they're talking to when they pick up the phone, when there's a lead that's been generated or an appointment set by your business development team. And the first things are first, have a good understanding of who this person is, what their typical objectives are, what responsibilities they own in the organization, and what kinds of context you're going to be, they have going on around them so that you can fit into that context. Once you get comfortable with the context, the target for the conversation, you need to understand what's going on in their world. So very quickly, what helps salespeople is a very simple, very digestible sense of the desired outcomes for these people that they're managing to that you could possibly affect, what's going on in the industry around those desired outcomes and the changes and trends, and then key to this is the risks that creates. The thing about opportunity creation is that it's not about solving the problem and how you do it better and different. It's about ensuring that they understand the risks that are involved are actually meaningful enough for you to want to change. Dislodging status quo and getting to real decisions and in creating a buying vision, step one means you have to convince them they have to do something different and that staying the same is riskier. Too many pieces of content leap to why we're better than someone else and totally skip this part right here. Next, we've done research to identify the exact framework or choreography for a winning access and disruptive, distinct point of view. I call it the why change story. How do you grab their attention? How do you specifically challenge their assumptions? How do you show clear contrast between what they're doing today and what you want to talk about and show them? And how do you bring that all together in a meaningful first dialogue? So the highlight here is I'm going to walk you through each of those 4 elements of a great opportunity creation conversation and how you can, again, equip someone to have this dialogue. So in the getting their attention phase, the idea here is that they need to hear about problems, opportunities, challenges, threats that they didn't even know they had. The key to solving or creating a buying vision isn't to solve for their known problems, the ones they know and they tell you. It's to tell them about problems, challenges, risks, and even missed opportunities they might be missing. So the first thing you do to grab their attention is not by telling them something they already know, but telling them something they didn't know. So here are some key facts, but not only just key factoids. Factoids aren't insightful. It's the so what that makes it insightful. So literally giving your salespeople conversation starters to grab people's attention with interesting facts and then what that could mean to that organization. We call it the unconsidered need. Not the one that they know, but the one they didn't know. Because the one they know isn't a big enough deal to make them change. It's the one they didn't see coming that actually disrupts status quo. So you've got to be very purposeful about the content you're creating in order to have a why change conversation. The risk is if you simply take voice of the customer research and identify known problems and then pitch yourself against those known problems, you will sound no different and no more disruptive than everybody else in your market. The real opportunity to create buying vision is to answer the why change question by telling them the thing they didn't know. And the key to that is challenging their current assumptions in a way that is simple enough, makes people confident enough to do. And so what you see in this opportunity creation dedicated why change playbook is this idea of now linking the things that grab their attention to current trends and the potential impact and what the current flaw is in their approach or flawed thinking. You're not going out and telling them they're stupid. What you're saying is many organizations like you that we work with and see are having a hard time responding to these needs they didn't know about because their current approaches have some flaws or some limitations. And again, it's not because the decision you made in the past was stupid. It's because things have moved around you in such a way that now you have to respond. And here's why people in your current state who are doing things the way you're currently doing, similar to you, can't respond as well. So here's the flaw in the approach and the flawed thinking. And then key to that is beginning to introduce the new thinking, the way to rethink, to reimagine solving for this problem based on overcoming those limitations. So grabbing their attention with an unconsidered need that they hadn't expected, moving that dialogue then to identifying the current limitations, flaws in their approaches and thinking, and now beginning to pivot to showing the contrast. When people are in the why change decision, the number one tool you have at your disposal is clearly delineating the contrast between what they're doing today and how you would do it tomorrow. Too often people equip their salespeople with messages to go out there and talk about what they're going to do different, what they do better, how that compares to competitors, and the customer is sitting way over here going, that's great, but I think I kind of do it that way already. I'm not sure I really see the difference. And the key for a customer to move off of their status quo and legitimately make a decision to change is they must see enough contrast between what they're doing today and what you're recommending, because change is hard, change is risky, and I'm not going to make a change if I'm going to get essentially more or less the same. And they can't appreciate what is so different and special about you until you put it in contrast to what they're currently doing. Most marketing and sales messaging completely misses the contrast. So think of an opportunity like this and opportunity creation dialogue like this. Before working with us, before engaging us, this is what people are struggling with, and this is what it feels like, and this is what they're dealing with. And after, this is the kind of thing that they see. This is what they feel. This is what they do different. This is what they do better. It has nothing to do with what your product is or what your product does. This entire dialogue is, here's what it feels like to be you today, what we see companies like you experiencing. Here's what it could feel like tomorrow. Think about the expansive contrast there, and this is what it would mean for you to make that change, to do that thing different and do that thing better in contrast. This is the value of that. A whole different spin, because you haven't even talked about a single bit of product or service, feature or benefit yet, because you're in the why change conversation, not the why you conversation. Then ultimately, you help them put that all together, and what we do is put sort of like a sample script. Remember, this is 89% of first calls are failures. If we can change that first call failure rate by a factor of some percentage points, you can start to see the difference that will make on conversion between lead and pipeline that converts, because you've unhinged the status quo and told the why change story, versus pipeline that gets stuck in no decision because you simply showed up trying to distinguish yourself in an undistinguishable manner. So just simple call scripts then about how to have that first call, how to structure it through this framework. Now, just some ideas for you that one of the things that we do when we help organizations do this is we're very aggressive in helping to tell simple, concrete visual stories that introduce the flawed approach and then the contrasting new way, and do that in a simple visual way so that these customers or prospects early on can literally imprint on their brain this difference between what they're doing today and doing tomorrow. You can say lots of words that people don't remember, but if you can show them very clearly the context for urgency in their flawed approach and the contrast between what you're going to help them do tomorrow, in that story, in that visual story, they can begin to imprint that they now own this. Words disappear like cotton candy, but visuals stick. Words disappear. 90% of the words you say disappear in less than 24 hours. You can increase that to remembering 65 to 70%. You can create a 7x increase in memorability by associating your why change story with a simple visual, and then giving salespeople demonstrations of that so they can tell the story and know how to tell a story, the ability to download those assets, download their scripts and storyboards right here in the playbook. Here's your first call visual story that you can do whether you're live or do online, and here's the coaching and, in fact, the training on how to do that. Here's why this is important. What we've learned as salespeople are just-in-time learners, just-in-time situational learners. They learn what they need to learn, when they need it, and for the situation they're in. And what we're taking advantage of in this opportunity creation playbook is they are in a deficient or deficit mode. Oh my gosh, I got to take a handoff here, and I got to be smooth, I got to be great, I got to overcome this 89% failure rate, and now I'm ready to learn. I want some messaging, I want some content assets, and I also want a little skills training right now because I need it. And if I took a class on how to be a better prospector and opportunity creator 2 years ago, or my class is scheduled 6 months from now, what good is it? I'm ready to learn when I'm in deficit and need the learning. So what we're sort of prescribing now is a playbook that converges the message, the content assets, and the specific training needed to use that message and those content assets all together in one package, one experience. We're no longer training separate and skills training separate from message launches. We recognize that a conversation is a conversation, and what I need in this moment is the messages for that conversation, the content for that conversation, and the skills to be great at that moment in that conversation. So a different way to think about this, a very important difference from that standpoint. Then, once you understand that you've dislodged and disrupted the status quo, people now see the need to possibly change. There's a moment of truth where they're going to ask that person on the other end of the line to say, so how exactly do you do that? How do you do that any different from anyone else? This is interesting. I'm buying. I'm biting. I'm moving towards sort of a dislodging of my status quo. But how is it that you do this And is there any way that you do this different than anybody else? So the important part of the opportunity creation playbook is you have that pivot handy. When it moves from a why change to a why you conversation, you don't want your salespeople to flounder and go, oh, wait, I got to get a different playbook for that. Or let me pull out my PowerPoint, or let me pull out my product training. So we have this idea that you need to be able to pivot from the why change to the why you, and in doing so, not, again, leap too far ahead to the capabilities of your products and services, but to specifically identify the most prominent business challenges that your product and service solves for. So across the top, you see, we're talking about the why you conversation. We identify the best way to have it, and here are the 3 business challenges you should be looking for and explaining that you solve for and solve for better than anybody else. And so simply the playbook then walks through each of the business challenges, identifies and describes it, helps the customer envision them taking ownership of solving for this, and then describing your uniqueness and differentiation in delivering on that. It's a very sort of prescriptive, but yet something we've scientifically proven with some of our studies in decision science, that identifying, corroborating, and getting buy-in to the challenge, helping people with what if you, imagine if questions to take ownership of the challenge and think about doing something different, and then planting your flag on that hill. These 3 business challenges are selected because you know that if you can get these to be the priority business challenges, this is where you stand the best opportunity of winning. The problem with most companies' why you presentations is you talk about everything. You talk about everything you do as opposed to just those things you do best. And what happens is most of what you do, if we're all honest with ourselves, is a lot like our competitors, your competitors do it. And so if you talk about everything you do, and then you got a couple of these 3 things that are really standout, the problem is in mass, most of what you do looks alike. And so the customer who's not as well-versed as you are projects a lot of sameness on all the competitors. We're recommending that your first why you conversation has to just laser in on the 3 main challenges that the customer needs to accomplish that you can solve for in some sort of advantaged or unique way. So by doing so, not only did you set the buying vision with the why change story, now you set the specification with your why you story. So it's very important that we always say you don't give them the whole piece of the pie, you just give them those wedges that are the best. And therefore, plant the seed in a way that doesn't overwhelm them, plant the seed in the way that, plant the flags on the hills that you can win on, and really set the bar for everybody else who has to follow that conversation. So ultimately, salespeople put this all together, leading with the why change conversation, transitioning to the why you conversation, and having a descriptive moment where they engage the challenge, they transfer the ownership to the customer of that challenge, and speak to the differentiation of what you bring to the table. So there you have it. The challenge, the disconnect, is that we see that too many companies are building content for demand gen and content for sales enablement that has no connective tissue. And as a result, we're asking salespeople to pick up a conversation because the assumption, faulty assumption, is that customers are moving down the path and now they want to understand why you and not somebody else. When in reality, the majority of the people you're going to engage with after some sort of social demand generation program still haven't decided to make the change. And until you equip and enable salespeople with content that crosses that conversion gap, it's going to continue to be a problem. And the dialogue that I really wanted to have today is to identify the challenge and the problem and the results of that, and give you, at least in our time frame, one big idea to deal with that. And hopefully that was accomplished in our brief time together. I want to offer you this free ebook on the B2B disconnect and a lot of what I said, and we will follow up as well with the slides. I saw some questions about the slides so that you can have a better look at some of the content that went by pretty fast in our brief moment here together. But this is free to you. We appreciate the opportunity to share this one big idea to fix this challenge. And now I'm going to take a couple questions. So one of the questions here from Gene says, what if you are being literal. Is an example of visual to use with a salesperson's story. You mean like a pic or an image of the product, or what type of image is so powerful versus language? The picture that you saw on my visual, and I don't have time to toggle all the way backwards, you can look at it in the slides, was what we really amounted to is a simple whiteboard-style visual, a simple concrete visual. The part of the brain you're appealing to in the early part of the buying cycle is not a complex part of the brain. And what it's trying to do is understand why what they're doing today isn't working, and they're trying to understand is there enough difference in what you're recommending for me to take the risk to make the change. So what we're talking about in the form of a visual is some sort of visual story that shows the current state and what the risks are associated with that, and the recommended future idea that you put on the table that would resolve that risk, and they could simply visually see that before and after image. This is what it looks like today, this is what it looks like tomorrow, because then the brain can picture the contrast. And then in that contrast is where value is communicated. Value is not communicated if you just talk about your product, service, features, and benefits. That means the customer has to infer why that's so much better or more valuable than the thing they're doing today. You actually need to aid that process and draw a descriptive image of what most companies like them who are approaching the problem similarly to them are dealing with. It's not their specific story. It's like an aggregated story of all the different people you meet with and see. You can say, here's what people are doing today. Here's the risks, here's the limitations, here's the missed opportunities, here's the challenges created by these new emerging external factors. Now, here's what we're proposing to resolve that, to eliminate that, to reduce that, to respond to that, to take advantage of that. And in that contrast between the current state and the future state is where the perception of value lies. What you want to do is create an image that they almost can't unsee. They keep remembering that image, that contrasting current state, future state image. While now it would be malpractice to not at least investigate why that possibility. The question from Tim here, does anybody use flip charts for visual anymore? I sure hope they do when they're in the room. We've done studies on the effectiveness of whiteboard imagery versus PowerPoint imagery, and both in memorability and perceived credibility and persuasive impact, we've been able to show a double-digit increase in doing simple concrete visuals on whiteboards and flip charts over using PowerPoint. People remember it better. They're able to retell it better, because that's the test we did. Can you remember the story and write down as much of it as you remember after you watch the PowerPoint versus when you watch the whiteboard? And we see double-digit increases in the what they can remember, how much, and the accuracy of what they remember, and in their willingness to retell and their ability to retell that story to someone else. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for you if you should be so inclined. And if you're online like this, you do what I did. My visuals look like whiteboards that were animating for you to create that same effect, even though I wasn't there to draw it for you. Other questions? I see one here about thoughts on sending video introductions to prospects. I have no problem, because I think video and visual is very powerful as long as it's using simple concrete imagery, and it does two things. It creates a context for urgency, and it introduces contrast for value. The problem I have is visuals aren't all created equal. Just sending a visual and video doesn't necessarily make it right or make it better. It's actually in the science of how the story is framed and told. You need to introduce unconsidered needs that they didn't expect, create a sense of urgency, and disrupt their status quo. And then you must show clear contrast between their current approach and their and your future recommendation, so that they understand there's some value there. So there's actual science into how the visual needs to be created and displayed. It isn't just that it's visual. So so anyways, any other questions? I've only got like 1 minute here, so I think we've covered what we can, because I see a very long question is my next question. Here's my offer to you. I'm going to take all these questions and download them. You can also ask them of me on LinkedIn, or you can ask them of me on Twitter, and I will answer them. I will download these, and in our reply to everybody with our slides, I will also answer these questions so that you have your question answered, and everybody gets the benefit of seeing that question answered. Because I am out of time for the day. Thank you again to the Social Selling Summit for this opportunity to introduced the B2B disconnect and content part of this story today, and hopefully shared with you one big idea, the opportunity creation story and playbook to accompany it as a way to overcome the conversion gap. So thank you very much. Have a great day.